Welcome to the Silent Casebook, where we uncover the untold and overlooked cases that deserve attention. Today we examine a crime that shattered a quiet English town on New Year's Day 2020, the brutal murders of Helen Hancock and Martin Griffiths. What should have been a night of celebration turned into an unspeakable tragedy when Helen's estranged husband, Reese Hancock, forced his way into her home and carried out a frenzied attack. It was a crime fueled by jealousy, control, and premeditated rage. This crime is not just about a brutal murder, it is the story of coercive control, domestic violence, and the devastating consequences when possessiveness turns to lethal violence. To understand how it all unfolded, we must first learn about the people at the heart of this tragedy. Behind every crime there are people, lives lived, choices made, paths crossed, until the moment that it all unravels. To understand the horror of what took place on New Year's Day 2020, we must first step back. We must meet the three people at the centre of it all. Helen Hancock, once a devoted mother, a beloved teacher, and a woman seeking a new chapter in her life. Martin Griffiths was a hard-working father, an adventurous spirit, and a man who found joy in the simplest moments. And Reese Hancock, the husband Helen left behind, a man who refused to let go, and the one who would seal their fates. Helen Hancock was a woman who lit up every room she entered. Born Helen Elmy, she grew up in the Midlands. Her childhood shaped by a love of learning and a natural ability to nurture those around her. She carried that passion into her career, becoming a dedicated physical education teacher, shaping the lives of countless children. She was more than just a teacher. She was a mother, fiercely devoted to her children, giving them the warmth and stability they deserved. Those who knew her described her as kind-hearted, vibrant, and full of life. Always ready with a smile, always putting others before herself. But behind closed doors, her life was far more complicated. Helen had been married to Reese Hancock, a man she once believed would be her partner for life. Their marriage, like many, had its struggles, but over time, those struggles became something more, something dangerous. It wasn't just arguments, it wasn't just control, possessiveness. A slow but suffocating grip that tightened with every passing year. Eventually, Helen made the hardest decision of all. She walked away, and for the first time in years, she began to breathe again. In the months that followed, Helen found happiness in an unexpected place. His name was Martin Griffiths. Martin was 48 years old, a marketing director, father of two, and a man who embraced life with open arms. He had a love for adventure, running, travelling, climbing mountains, always pushing himself and always finding new adventures. But above all else, he was a father. His children were at the centre of his world, and those who knew him spoke of his kindness, his laughter, and the way he made people around him feel valued. Helen and Martin had been together for only 6 months, but in that short time they found something rare, a sense of peace, a second chance at happiness. But not everyone was willing to let that happen. At one point, Reese Hancock was a respected man, a head teacher, a leader in education, someone who commanded respect in his field, but titles mean nothing when the mask begins to slip. Reese had spent years controlling Helen, and when she finally left him, his grip tightened. He was a man who couldn't stand the thought of losing, a man who believed Helen still belonged to him. After their separation, he became erratic. His behaviour spiralled. Helen had reached out to the police before. She had warned them. She had tried to protect herself. But nothing stopped what was coming. Because in Reese Hancock's mind, there was only one solution. If he couldn't have Helen, no one could. 3 lives on 3 different paths. But on the night of December 31st, 2019, those paths would collide for the final time. And by the morning, 2 of them would be gone. No act of violence happens in isolation. There are always signs, moments that build upon each other, piece by piece, until the inevitable unfolds. The murders of Helen Hancock and Martin Griffiths were not spontaneous. They were the end result of a storm that had been gathering for months. A storm fueled by obsession, jealousy, and the refusal to let go. For years, Helen and Reese Hancock's marriage had been strained. What began as love had soured into something much darker. Friends and family noticed the changes, Reese's temper, his possessiveness, the way he made sure that Helen knew she was his. To the outside world, Reese was a respected head teacher, a man in control. But behind closed doors, Helen saw the real him, the anger, the manipulation, the way he made her feel small. It took time, but Helen gathered the strength to leave. She wanted a new start for herself, for her children. She separated from Reese, and for the first time in years, she felt free. Their relationship was new, only 6 months old, but it was real, and that was enough. Enough for Helen to believe she could finally move on. For Reese Hancock, the separation wasn't an ending. It was an insult, a wound to his pride that refused to heal. The thought of Helen with another man consumed him. He spoke about it openly, his anger, his resentment. His mother saw the signs. She knew his state of mind was unraveling. She wasn't the only one. Helen had spoken to the police before. She had warned them about Reese's behavior. She tried to make them listen, but there were no arrests, no protections, just words in a report filed away. December the 31st of 2019, while Helen and Martin celebrated together at their home in Dudfield, Reese Hancock sat alone at his mother's house in Etwall, drinking and thinking, letting his anger fester. Then at some point in the night he made a decision. He told his mother exactly what he was going to do. He was going to kill Helen. He was going to kill Martin, and no one stopped him. Reese took his mother's car. He left knowing exactly where he was going, knowing exactly what he was about to do. He wasn't acting in a blind rage. He wasn't out of control. He was calm and focused, methodical. But this wasn't just murder. This was a plan. By the time the clock struck midnight, Helen and Martin had no idea that their fate had already been sealed. Reese Hancock was coming for them, and within hours their lives would be stolen in a frenzy of unimaginable violence. This was not just a crime, this was an execution. New Year's Eve, a night of celebration, of reflection, of looking forward to the future. But for Helen Hancock and Martin Griffiths there was no future, because while they welcomed in the new year together, Reese Hancock was already on his way. His mind was made up, his plan was in motion, and by morning 2 lives would be gone. It was just after 4 a.m. when Reese Hancock pulled into New Zealand Lane, Duffield. The streets were quiet. The celebrations had ended. Inside Helen's home, she and Martin were asleep upstairs, unaware of the nightmare about to unfold. Reese stepped out of his mother's car. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicked. He was calm, composed, and focused. In his hands, he carried 2 kitchen knives taken from his mother's home before he set off. He walked straight up to the front door and tried the handle. It was locked. That was nothing more than a small obstacle to Reese. He forced his way in. It was quick. A few violent kicks to the door and the frame splintered under the force. The lock gave way. He was inside. The house, once warm and safe, was now a hunting ground, and Reese was the predator. Upstairs, the noise had awoken them, but by the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Reese burst into the bedroom, knives in hand. There was no hesitation, no warning. He went for Martin first. A blade plunged into his left shoulder, then his neck before he even had time to react. The force was brutal, unrelenting, and so savage that Martin stood no chance. Martin tried to fight back. There were signs of a struggle, defensive wounds on his hands and arms, evidence that he had tried to desperately shield himself from the onslaught. But Reese overpowered him. The attack was frenzied, delivered with terrifying speed and rage. Martin collapsed, his body crumbling under the sheer force of the blows. But Reese wasn't finished. Helen was next. She screamed, a desperate, terrified cry for help that never came. The knife slashed at her. More wounds, more pain, more blood, just like Martin. She tried to fight back and tried to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The man she had once been married to, the man she tried to leave behind, was making sure she never left again. By the time it was over, the bedroom was a scene of total devastation. Blood pooled across the floor, the walls, the bed. Both Helen and Martin lay motionless, their bodies riddled with stab wounds. Helen's injuries were so horrific, so severe that one of the knives was found entirely buried within her abdomen. In total, 66 injuries were inflicted on her, a testament to the ferocity of the attack. Martin had fought hard, but against a man armed, enraged, and determined, it hadn't been enough. And Reese, well, he simply stood there, looking at what he had done. There was no escape attempt, no panic. Reese picked up the phone and dialed 999. His voice was flat, almost indifferent as he spoke. "I just murdered 2 people. The operator asked him to clarify. He did, without hesitation, without remorse. He gave them his name, the address, and then he waited. The first officers arrived minutes later. They found Reese outside the house, standing near his mother's car, his clothes soaked in blood. He didn't struggle and he didn't resist. He was arrested immediately. Inside the house, paramedics rushed in, hoping for any sign of life, but there was none. Helen and Martin were already gone. The sheer violence of the attack was immediately clear. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of madness. The violence inside Helen Hancock's home had ended, but the devastation it left behind was only just the beginning. 2 lives stolen, 2 families shattered, a community in mourning, and now the search for justice would begin. When police entered Helen's home on New Zealand Lane, they were met with a scene of pure carnage. The bedroom where Helen and Martin had been attacked was a bloodbath, evidence of the sheer ferocity and rage behind the crime. Both victims lay lifeless, their bodies covered in deep stab wounds. The room bore clear signs of struggle, indicating they had fought desperately to defend themselves, but to no avail. One of the murder weapons, a large kitchen knife, was still embedded in Helen's abdomen, a chilling reminder of the violence inflicted upon her. Even experienced officers were shaken by the brutality that they witnessed. Outside the house, Reese Hancock stood waiting for them, his clothes soaked in blood. When Reese was taken to the police station, his demeanor didn't change. He didn't ask about Helen. He didn't ask about Martin. He knew exactly what he had done, and he didn't seem to care. The police wasted no time in building their case against Reese Hancock, but in reality they didn't need to search far. They had his full confession and they had the forensic evidence. They also had witnesses who had heard him declare his intent to kill Helen and Martin just hours before he did it. There was no mystery, no doubt about who had committed this crime, only the question of what justice would look like. As the investigation unfolded, a painful truth began to emerge. Helen had reported concerns about Reese before. There had been warning signs that she wasn't safe, and yet nothing had been done. She had reached out to the police. She had expressed fear about what he might do, but no action had been taken, and now it was too late. With Reese Hancock already in custody, the legal process moved quickly. The Crown Prosecution Service charged him with 2 counts of murder, a case so open and shut that there was no question of guilt, only of sentencing. The trial would take place at Derby Crown Court, where the families of Helen and Martin would finally face the man who destroyed their lives, a man who had taken everything from them, and a man who even now showed no remorse for what he had done. The murders of Helen Hancock and Martin Griffiths were not crimes of impulse. They were planned, deliberate, and fueled by rage. Reese Hancock had made his intentions clear even before he left his mother's home that night, and now, standing in a courtroom, he would finally have to face the consequences of his actions. The families of Helen and Martin had waited for months for this moment. Justice was coming, but no sentencing would ever undo the devastation that he'd left behind. From the moment of his arrest, there was never any doubt. Reese had confessed immediately. He told the police exactly what he had done. In the days following his arrest, Hancock appeared at Southern Derbyshire Magistrates Court, flanked by security, his face blank, his hands bound. He spoke only to confirm his name. His charges were read out, 2 counts of murder. There was no reaction. The judge wasted no time. A case of this magnitude belonged in Derby Crown Court, where his fate would be sealed. Months passed. Investigators pieced together the full horror of that night. Forensic evidence, witness statements, the chilling 999 call. Then on the 6th of July 2020, in a virtual hearing at Derby Crown Court, Hancock spoke again for the first time since his arrest, and he admitted it. Guilty. He pleaded guilty to both counts of murder. He had no remorse or justification, just the cold admission of a man who had done the unthinkable. On October the 1st, 2020, Reese Hancock was brought before Derby Crown Court for sentencing. The courtroom was heavy with grief. Helen's family sat together, silent but resolute. Martin's loved ones clutched one another's hands. The man responsible for their pain sat in the dock awaiting his fate. Judge Nirmal Shant, QC, took a seat. The case was about to be closed, but not before the full weight of Hancock's crimes were laid bare. Michael Orty, QC, speaking for the prosecution, wasted no time. He painted the picture of a man who had planned every step of his crime, a man who had taken 2 knives, driven with intent, and slaughtered not in the heat of the moment, but with careful calculation. Hancock's own mother had warned the police that night, told them that her son was on his way to commit murder, but no one could stop him, and now 2 innocent people were gone. He described the killings as savage and merciless, laying bare the sheer brutality of what Hancock had done. For the defense, Clive Stockwell QC had little to offer. There was no justification, no explanation. He simply described Hancock as a broken man, someone who had struggled to accept the loss of control over his marriage. He spoke of Hancock's previous standing in society, of his career as a respected head teacher, but none of it mattered, because nothing could erase what he had done. Finally, Judge Nirmal Shant QC turned her attention to the man in the dock. Her words were clear, unforgiving. You committed not one, but 2 murders. Your attack was brutal, relentless. She spoke of the premeditation, how Hancock told his mother what he had planned to do. She spoke of the sheer violence, how Helen suffered 66 separate injuries, and how Martin had no chance to escape. Then came the final ruling: life in prison with a minimum term of 31 years before parole. A full courtroom, a family still broken, and a man shackled led away to begin his sentence. Justice had been served, but for those who had lost Helen and Martin, it would never be enough. The silent casebook exists to tell the stories that should never be forgotten. The murders of Helen Hancock and Martin Griffiths were not isolated acts of violence. They were the tragic result of coercive control and unchecked obsession. Their story must serve as a warning, a reminder that domestic abuse does not always look like bruises and broken bones. It can be words, control, isolation, and manipulation, and when ignored, it can turn deadly. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, please don't wait until it's too late. Help is available, and support is out there. In the UK, if you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, confidential support is available through the National Domestic Abuse Helpline known as Refuge. The numbers and contact details will be put in the description below. There is also a men's advice line where support is provided for male victims of domestic abuse. There is also Gallup, which provides support for LGBTQ+ victims of abuse. Victim support is for all victims of crime, including domestic abuse. Karma Nirvana is for victims of honor-based abuse and forced marriage. As I mentioned, all contact numbers and contact information can be found in the description below. If you found this case coverage insightful, please consider subscribing to the Silent Casebook for more in-depth true crime investigations. We tell the stories that matter, the stories that deserve to be heard. And if you want to make sure you never miss a video, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications.